Hey guys, Loman02. I wanted to share a 100-card Singleton deck tech and gameplay video with you guys. So the deck you have in front of you is White Weenie. It does have some taxing effects in it, and the reason I wanted to share this deck is, one, it's relatively cheap on Magic Online to play, and it's exceedingly competitive as well in the format. It does have some soft matchups like the Wrath.deck, kind of like the blue-white Splash Black Miracles list that I was playing last week, maybe Big Red as well. But at the end of the day, this is one of the more efficient, permanent-based threat decks that are available in the format, and it's exceedingly quick and tends to present a very fast clock, and has a significant amount of resilience despite being a 50-creature deck. First thing you'll note is it's a 33 land mana base. Now, this one right here is less taxing than some other versions like White-Black, but it does have the Wasteland Rishadan Port option, Windbrisk Heights for utility because this deck will be attacking a lot. It intends on getting some good value off that. Karaka's Horizon Canopy, Exano Castle, which is rarely useful, Flagstones of Troy here, which has good synergies with Armageddon, or the two Armageddons that are in the deck, and the Cataclysm that's in sideboard. The Mishra's Factory and Mutavault, because both are just free threats essentially, added to the mana base, then a whole bunch of planes. We play the maximum number of fetch lands as well, because despite playing a 33 land deck, which is still pretty light, typically speaking you want to thin your deck as much as possible so you can consistently draw a high volume of threats. Of note, we are also a land tax deck because I find that it synergizes very well with Armageddon and Ravages of War. Likewise, Mox Diamond. No better way to get some value back from your land tax than having a Mox Diamond in hand and being capable of casting things a turn sooner on essentially a speed aggro deck. But it does have a little more going than that. So you have a bunch of taxing effects and just a ton of really efficient threats. Like Dryad Militant, just a great taxing threat. Figure, just a model of efficiency in Stud of War. Soldier of the Pantheon actually has a protection clause. The life gain can sometimes be relevant, but generally speaking it's not. Sky Marcher Aspirant, one of the better one-drops printed in a while for this style of deck. The fact that it can get flying is highly relevant, as getting a flying 2-1 for 1 mana is very good. Savannah Lions, mostly for nostalgia. Mother of Runes, typically a 2-for-1 advantage card, as it'll take 2 removal spells to get rid of it, and or like a Grim Lavamancer activation plus a spell. Mardu War Reaper, marginal utility against the Reanimator decks. Typically it's a little too slow for that, and there's not a lot of warriors, so the first trigger is probably the only one you're going to get. That said, you typically don't want to exile out of your own graveyard because your own life total is not going to be as relevant as leaving dead creatures in there because of this last pile over here, which I consider the Wrath Proofing pile that contains Hallowed Spirit Keeper, which tends to get you a lot of value back out of your graveyard if you're losing creatures in like an attritional matchup. Ismaru, just a fine threat. Gideon's Lawkeeper, can't say enough about these style of cards. I have 2 tappers in the deck. He's sitting next to his brother right here, Whipquarter. We could play the Kithkin that does the same thing, but these cards are invaluable. They stop anything from, like Siege Rhino to Gristlebrand or Emrakul, and being able to stop the most threatening threat in the game for 2 mana investment, and still having a 1/1 body is just extreme value. Gideon's Lawkeeper is a card that I can't speak highly enough about. Expedition Envoy, again, just a Savannah Lions, a little more relevant in that it's a human. It synergizes well with our Thalia's Lieutenant and some of our human synergies. Dragon Hunter, again, a 2/1. The protection from dragons has rarely, if ever, been relevant for me, but it's not to say it might not be at some point. Deathblade Elite, very high on this card. This card doesn't look like much, but Provoke is a very powerful mechanic. It helps you knock out Noble Hierarchs. If you can get equipment on this, or a +1/+1 counter, through various means, like it could be Anafenza Kintree Speaker, it could be Thalia's Lieutenant, it could be, because it's a soldier, it could be Sen's Tactician right here. This card can normally snipe like Mana Dorks or just small cards. It also allows you to essentially get through, as it acts for the most relevant threat on the opponent's side as essentially, what do they call it, a flag bearer? Not a flag bearer, master decoy. But the fact that it can prevent all combat damage to itself is highly relevant, because if your opponent lands like Batterskull or Wormcoil Engine, and you just need to close the last few points, you send the team in, prevent all combat damage from this thing and to it, and the lifelink is nullified, and the rest of your team generally gets through. Dauntless Bodyguard, very new print right here. Card's stellar, though. It's a very, very good one-drop that generally scales pretty well as the game goes on. And I guess, this could also go over here as well in the Wrath proofing, because that's what it does. Champion of the Parish, a lot of humans in this, and it's really a curve tech deck, so you should be going 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop generally pretty easily. Benevolent Bodyguard, people discount this card sometimes. This card's amazing. It's not Mother of Runes, but it's pretty close, and the fact that it can have that effect on the turn it comes into play is not irrelevant. It can often force an opponent's hand before a combat step, so you can avoid blowouts. So I find the card very valuable. Going into the 2 pile, you have Enofenza, Kintree Spirit. This thing is just amazing. It just bolsters every time something comes into play, which tends to be pretty good in a deck that has small creatures that generally have high synergy effects and a lot of first strike and evasion. Values Lieutenant. Again, just +1/+1 counters on probably over half of the deck's creatures, and it just grows whenever you cast more, so it's a good card. Whipquarter, already talked about this thing's brother in the 1-mana spot. I think this card's great, also relevant. It's Human Soldier, which is pretty good. Sierra Avenger, not a human soldier, but a very efficient 3/3 that is great to cast on turn 4 with a secondary threat at the same time, and can close out games very fast, being a flyer. Gets around moat, etc. Very good card. Soltari Priest, evasive, protection from red, sometimes relevant. The fact that it can't block does limit it a little bit against the red deck wins matchup, but the fact that it can get through tends to mean it's a pretty good clock against that deck. Precinct Captain, just an army in a can card, just a great 2-drop. You can't really replace this guy with much. Leona Relic Order, this is one of our few main deck ways of dealing with artifacts outside of Council's Judgment, or Flicker Wisp for a very short-term removal of the artifact. But this card is a bomb. Unless they print something else that has this effect against artifacts or enchantments, which is what this does, I don't think this card is going to be coming out anytime soon. Knight of the White Orchid. This card is 2-for-1 advantage, ramps you, and is also just a decent body, a 2/2 first striker, and a human knight to boot. Knight of the Holy Nimbus, very old card, Ice Age, I believe. Card is just a pain in the butt to kill. Someone has to pay 2, so basically it doesn't regenerate for free. If it gets destroyed, not exiled, but destroyed, if they don't pay 2, it just regenerates itself. Great card. Generally means that if they Wrath, and I guess this could go over here too, if they Wrath on turn 4 and they're not leaving up mana and this thing's on the board, it's just going to stick around and eventually beat them down. Knight of the Metal Grain. Card's a little more dubious, but it has a lot of evergreen abilities on it. It's a 2/2. It is a knight. Oftentimes, if you pair this up with something like Silverblade Paladin or put a couple counters on it, with one of our Planeswalkers over here, Johnny, it's just phenomenal. One drop I skip, but I put over here in the Planeswalker pile because ideally you're turning it into one as Scythian. Probably one of the best aggressive 1-drops ever printed. And I say aggressive. Now, it's up there with Figure of Destiny, which I think is also a pretty solid aggressive 1-drop. And I'm kind of discounting stuff like Goblin Guide, stuff that's not in white. But as far as white aggressive 1-drops go, probably one of the better ones. Obviously, it gets a lot worse in multiples, but we don't have to worry about that when we're playing Singleton. Next up, we have Thalia. Card's a bomb. Since we have 50 creatures in deck, we do have some spells, but 50 creatures is a significant amount, and typically speaking, it's not going to be an effect that hurts us that bad. Spirit of the Labyrinth, just a great effect against the decks that want to draw cards. This deck does not really draw cards. The only way it can do that is through land tax, which is technically not drawing, or a card like Palace Jailer, where you can get Monarchy. You can get some card advantage with Stoneforge Mystic as well. It's a 2-for-1, but you're not really drawing a ton with this deck. Next up, you have Relic Seeker. Obviously, a strictly worse Stoneforge Mystic, but still a Stoneforge Mystic in some ways. You still have to hardcast the artifact, but if you hit, you get 2-for-1 advantage off of it, and I think it's worthy of a nod. And I'll put it over in the equipment pile right now. Next up, we have Leonin Arbiter. The card is a beast. Stops a lot of the combo decks, stops fetch lands. This deck has 4 fetch lands in it, but typically speaking, outside of land tax or Stoneforge shenanigans or the 4 fetches, we're not really tutoring a bunch. Flagstones of Troy here's another situation which kind of comes up sometimes. But oftentimes, by the time you're getting to a point where you want to be able to tutor with some of your minor tutor effects, you can pay for this card if you need to do it, and it's going to disrupt your opponent to a much more significant extent than it will disrupt you generally in this deck. Of course, Skyfisher, this is the White Gush. It's a great rate, a 2-3 body that flies, and it bounces to land, which may seem like a detriment when you first read it. I know the first time, I was probably less experienced when I read it. You think, oh, this card's actually kind of bad. It's a card that should cost 3 mana, generally by standard, Magic exchange standards or economic standards of mana, but it bounces to land, so that's got to be bad because it's going to screw up your next turn. Well, it's a 33 land deck, so if your land light deck, typically speaking, bouncing a land is actually making a land drop on the next turn, or even on the turn you're on. So if you cast this thing on turn 3, but you only have 2 lands, you've actually actualized a mana in that turn. If you have something like Savannah Lions, you just drop that as well and just have a more efficient turn. Very powerful card. Its downside, quote unquote, is actually an upside in a lot of ways if you build to make it so. Imposing Sovereign, very powerful effect. Creatures coming into play tapped for your opponent means they're not going to be they're going to be blocking a turn later, which oftentimes gives you enough damage to foment a race with your opponent, as opposed to allowing them to set up a board stall. Containment Priest, I think this is a very worthy main deckable card. It combines well with cards like Flicker Wisp, the Journeys to Nowhere, and the Palace Jailer. It also combines well with, because if they ever do manage to blow up the Journey or attack you and hit you, then their card just gets put in the exiled zone, which is pretty solid. Additionally, in the sideboard, it's also just great against Reanimators. It's good main deck tech. It's also just a fine card. It's 2/2 for 2, and it flashes in. We also have Parallax Wave, which can essentially become 5 STPs with this card if they don't kill it and then blow up the Parallax Wave. In the 3 pile, we have Boros Reckoner, which is essentially a mirror breaker and also a breaker of the red deck wins matchup. Silverblade Paladin, just a humongous clock. This thing just is a massive beating. Mirror Crusader randomly hoses the heck out of some decks, and against a lot of others is just a decent clock. If it gets a couple counters on it, the thing is an unstoppable force. Bramaz, just a huge dude. This thing is just massive. And what it does is pretty game-breaking if they don't interact with it very rapidly. So, I don't think there's much to be said about it. A 3/4 that's an army in a can and has vigilance and blocks as well as he attacks is just a bomb. Thalia Heretic Cathar, this card is also a bomb. Probably in this format better than the 2 mana variety of Thalia, wherever she's hiding at over here. Against the 4-color decks, just stifles their mana for basically 2 turns for each fetch land they have. And also slows them down in the same way that Imposing Sovereign does, so you can just maintain the tempo. Bygone Bishop, card advantage engine, also a flyer, which is probably the most relevant part. I don't know if I would... I've never played Mentor of the Meek in this deck, but this card sold me because, one, it's the same rate as Mentor of the Meek. It's free to get the card, which... is oftentimes more conditional. I actually like it better than having to pay 1. 1 is cheaper, that is true, but typically speaking, you want to get pressure down, and then once you run out of gas, use your clues to get draw back into it. So the turn you're actually casting threats is not always the turn you want to spend the mana to draw cards, which is why I think this is actually a peg up from a card like Mentor of the Meek. And it's also just a better body. It's 2/3, and it flies. So isn't that a shock? And it flies over the top of most things. Even Mind Sensor, despite being a decent-bodied flyer, for a decent rate, probably a lower rate than most of the other cards in this deck, has a very game-breaking effect in that it kind of complements the Aleon and Arbiter against the decks that require a lot more tutoring of their deck to have the game go right. Porcelain Legionnaire can really go in the 2 pile, as you will rarely, unless you top deck it, cast this thing for 3 mana. But a 3/1 First Strike is just a huge body. It generally can beat down through a lot of things until about turn 4, and 6 damage off of it is not unreasonable and is very powerful. This pile right here, you have the Planeswalkers, Kithian, which is really a 1-drop, turns into a pretty game-breaking card very early in the game, as early as turn 3. A Johnny, Caller of the Pride, probably the weakest Planeswalker, but because we're a beatdown deck, this card really does allow you to close out games. So this card does nothing on its own without other creature cards, but when you're playing 50, I feel like you could afford to play a card like this. You may ask, why don't I have the 4-mana Johnny? I think it's just Johnny Goldmane. That card's too slow, and I think Gideon and Elspeth are just better cards in general for that. Even though I do think the 4-mana Johnny's very good, I just didn't want another 4-drop in the deck with the 2 Geddons and the Elspeth Gideon plus the Palace Jailer. Those are kind of my committed 4s. You'll note this deck doesn't even play Hero of Bladehold. I just found the card was too slow. That's amazing to say in a 100-card format with this much variance, but Hero of Bladehold just dies to too much, and if they have it, they're going to burn it on Hero Bladehold, and then you're kind of holding the bag because it doesn't do as much as a Geddon or as a Planeswalker. They can Wrath over the top of your creatures, and then if you have the Walker still, the Walker is going to crack in there for 5 or put a 1/1 down and eventually attack for 4 the next turn. I don't think I've ever ultimated a Johnny in this, but his ultimate's not bad. Typically speaking, you're going to do 2 pluses on it and then a minus and just win the game, but it's pretty quick to win. Gideon card broke Standard, basically. Was the best card in Standard for a long time, and it's up there probably in the top 10 Planeswalkers ever printed. Same with Elspeth Knight-Errant. I consider these probably the 2 best white Planeswalkers. Well, correction, the 2 best aggressive white Planeswalkers. Elspeth, Sun's Champion, is probably the best white control Planeswalker ever printed, in my opinion, but these 2 are extremely powerful. Equipment package, pretty simple. Umezawa's Jitte is banned in the format. Batterskull, Sword of Fire and Ice, Stoneforge Mystic, and Relic Seeker kind of help you get after your protection package plus its card drawing advantage and or card advantage off of the sword. Not to mention removal. And then the Batterskull, which is just you get this thing down with Stoneforge, like, it warps the game because they're playing a game where they're trying to get rid of it, and you're just continuing to develop. Brave the Elements, kind of a place of its own. It is protection in some cases, and it is an alpha strike for lethal in a lot of other cases. So, not a lot of combat tricks in this deck, but this is one that I think surely deserves its place because it has won me many of games. The next one is the Anthem package, so I try to put as many Anthems as I possibly can on bodies. I am playing one that does not have a body, namely Honor of the Pure, because it's very efficient, and it's one-sided. Council's Lieutenant, one-sided, and during the attack, which is pretty relevant because this deck wants to attack. Badalish Marshal, newly printed, all your creatures get +1/+1. Just a beast of a card. I don't think much needs to be said about it. Honor of the Pure, just extremely efficient. Works with tokens, which this deck can produce off of a couple of cards. And it's just 2 mana, which is a pretty good rate for that effect. 2 Geddons. Probably the most powerful effects in the deck. Probably the most busted draws circulate around Geddon. 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop Armageddon is generally how this deck would always love to go. If it can always go that way, it probably wins most of its games. Flagstones of Troikir in the 33-land mana base that combines very well with it. Land tax combines well with it, gives you card advantage, and also plays well with the Ravages and Armageddon. And then the Mox Diamond, which I think plays well with land tax, and also the Geddon effects. Removal. So only 7 pieces of actual removal outside of the combat step, and that is Swords to Plowshares, Oust, Path to Exile, Journey to Nowhere, Council's Judgment, Flicker Wisp, and Palace Jailer. Flicker Wisp is probably pretty poor removal, but typically speaking, this deck only needs to remove things for a very short time frame in order to win. It's really more so about finding a time and place to use it on the right thing, and then just getting in there with a combat step. Same thing with Palace Jailer. Yeah, it can come back, but you draw a card off of this, and typically speaking, you open a hole in your opponent's defense and just exploit it with your more tempo-oriented deck. Council's Judgment, just probably the best removal, some of the best removal ever made. It's basically, how do you call it? It's basically a strictly better Chaos Orb because it exiles. Well, in some contexts, Chaos Orb actually destroys itself. So I guess if you have like a Guardian Beast, or I can't think of the damn card's name, Darksteel Tower, whatever that card is that makes all artifacts indestructible, and I guess you could reuse it, but Chaos Orb's not a card that's even legal in any format outside of Old School, so this is pretty much it if you want to get rid of something. You exile it, you vote on it, so it's not even targeted, just great. Journey to Nowhere, just efficient, and does not rely on the combat steps. There's a lot of them that rely on combat steps in order to use at the 2 spot. I think this is probably just the best 2-mana removal in White Weenie, or 4 White Weenie. And then Oust, Path to Exile, and Swords to Plowshares. You know we don't have Condemn in there. There's a new one, I think it's Seal Away. I would play Condemn before I would play Seal Away, even though Seal Away doesn't gain them life. But 2 mana is a massive investment. And Condemn's just a better card than it is, because Condemn just puts it on the bottom of their library, and that's it, and they gain 3 life or whatever. Or maybe it's they gain toughness, life equal to toughness, I forget. Condemn's just not a good card for this deck, though, because it requires them to be attacking you. And typically speaking, folks are not attacking this deck. If they're attacking you, that means they have control. And if they have control, you're probably losing. This last pile here is the Wrath proofing of the deck. So we already talked about Knight of the Holy Nimbus, just very hard to kill. Dauntless Bodyguard, if you draw it late, can tend to be Wrath proofing. It allows you to save your 1 best threat. Hallowed Spirit Keeper makes a bazillion 1/1s if they want to Wrath over the top of it. Selfless Spirit, essentially says, hey, your Wrath of God trades for my one Selfless Spirit. Smuggler's Copter, despite being a one-sided card advantage engine, also does not get blown up by Wrath. So if they Wrath you, cool, drop a 1-drop or a 2-drop on the next turn, activate this thing, and just keep on beating down. As far as sideboard goes, we have a couple anti-artifact cards in here, Disenchant and Fragmentize, which I think are fairly strong in this current meta. Mark of Asylum, which is good versus the red-based removal decks, blue-red burn, any burn deck, just tends to save you. Vridden Wingmare against like the control style decks that have a lot of big expensive spells in them. Cataclysm, same. Good against control. Like basically good against the decks that you really want Armageddon in. Because even if you keep one threat, if you knock them down to one land and they're on control and they're casting like a lot of 3s and 4s, they're going to lose the game. Like, that's just game over. Parallax Wave, good against mid-range, good in the mirror, very strong. Hushwing Griff, just good versus the value mid-range decks, like the Green X decks. I tend to like Hushwing Griffin. Yeah, we have some ETBs ourselves, but typically speaking, our creatures just kind of stand on their own. Sword of Light and Shadow, good versus the control decks, like the Wrath the board deck, because you can just buy back creatures with it, and there are a ton to buy back. Ethersorn Canonist, kind of an overture to the possibility of Storm in the meta, even though I haven't seen it played by anyone yet. And the card is powerful against some other decks as well. Auric Champion, good versus aggressive decks. Whether it be the mirror or just be like red beatdown. Core Firewalker, same thing, just hoses red. Same thing with Silver Knight, just hoses red. Winter Orb, could be main deck. Not always necessary though, but it's just a beast. Curse Scroll, for protection white creatures or anything like that, Curse Scroll can just deal with it. Or against, some decks where you think they're going to be able to control your board and, an artifact like this on a deck that can dump its hand is just very powerful to close the game out after you get them down very low. Burton Forge Tender, same. Stops, red burn from damaging your creatures. It's very good. I bring it in a lot against blue-red as well, because if they use something like Pyroclasm, you can just pop this thing and it prevents all the damage from Pyroclasm, and, you probably continue on to win the game. So, that is the deck. I'm going to show you guys a couple games right now, because I'd like to try to generate some interest in this format, because it's not a format that a lot of folks play, despite it being probably the most elegant. So, a lot of my content is either 93-94 or this format here, 100-card Singleton. The reason I love both formats a lot is because almost anything is viable and can be played. There are cheap decks in both, but you can play a lot of different types of Magic when you play these formats, and, you can either do something as simple as what we're about to do right now, or you can do something as sophisticated as what my opponent appears to be up to. So I see Celestial Colonnade, and I presume that I'm playing against Esper Control here. I don't have a bad hand against Esper Control. I've got a Smuggler's Copter, which is a good starting spell, especially when they've played 2 tap lands, and likely cannot counter it unless they have Spell Snare or Spell Pierce. So I resolve my Copter, and I'm pretty happy to get it down. My opponent plays Verdant Catacombs, finds a Savannah, which now I'm like, I don't have any clue what they're playing. So I just play out the Thalia Heretic Athar. I figure their mana base has to be exceedingly greedy if they're playing Thalia, and it appears now that they're on some sort of mid-range. So they did a very good job of concealing what they were playing to me. They go ahead and fetch again, but they fetch a basic this time so they don't have the negative tempo loss. I find a basic here. Go ahead and Armageddon over the top of these threats. Send with both, after tutoring for my land, of course. Send with both. Figure I'm going to trade here. I do, and my opponent's doing more damage, but I already have them lower, and I'm going to win this race on 2 lands. Hitting the second land, or the last land, the 5th land that I got there, was what sold me on the Armageddon play, because they were likely to play like some big bomby threat like Thragtusk or something, and it looks like they're more reliant on their colored mana sources than we are on ours, and we make a good guess here because we're handily able to out-tempo them. We're going to go in for lethal next turn and just close the game out. So as you can see, that's kind of the power of this deck. Like, it has the ability to, 1, 2, 3, and in this case we didn't have the 1, but 2, 3, 4, into Armageddon and just win. If it has like a very low mana count in hand, or flagstones, like, you can win with the game very easily with 1 to 2 lands in this deck. And that's what we ended up doing here, is kind of forcing an opponent, Sung here, who had a more ambitious mana base and probably more powerful spells, but more reliance on her mana, into a very bad spot where even though she had the biggest threat on the board, we were able to out-tempo her with our many efficient threats. So that was game 1. Game 2 is a little more lengthy, but shows the power of this deck's ability to grind through cards you would not typically think it could. So I make consideration this game to actually play out the fetch land first and fetch, but I go against that because I figure I probably do want 4 lands with this hand, so I can 2-spell 2 2-drops on my turn 4. So I cast the Knight of the Meadowgrain here to block the Scavenging Ooze. She makes what I consider a fairly, well, not a hugely questionable play, but a questionable play. She gets a Noble Hierarch here to get 3 damage in, which I think is a little bit dicey, because I'm still going to gain 2 back, and I oftentimes don't feel like getting that 3 in was that relevant here. She does have a Siege Rhino, though, so I think she was trying to go for like an out-tempo me play, but she's not probably going to out-tempo White Weenie. She has to realistically look for a line to control me. And because I have Gideon's Lawkeeper, I'm going to be able to tap down her biggest and best threats every turn. She plays a Tasker, which is a great blocker. I go ahead and just resolve the Ajani here and just oblige that I'm not going to be able to, or acknowledge that I'm not going to be able to tap down either the Siege Rhino or the Tasker, but know that she's going to be forced to start attacking because Ajani will eventually beat her. I play a Silverblade Paladin, which is just a monumental beating. And at this point, I have very good protection on my side of the board, but I still don't really have an attack because the True Name Nemesis is untapped. So I go ahead and tap the Siege Rhino. My plan here is to force her to attack with the True Name, and then tap down the Tassiger on my turn so I can start actually destroying her creatures. I do go ahead and play an Honor of the Peer to bolster my team. Play out Sen's Tactician to get some random bolster going on, and then go ahead and put a +1/+1 counter on my Silverblade here, and then just swing in with all of my cards, forcing some very unenviable blocks from my opponent to knock out both the Scavenging Ooze and Avacyn's Pilgrim. Now, my Ajani has died at this point, but I feel like I've handily been able to out-tempo my opponent to this point to get her life total adequately low, and to also force her into a position where her best blocker is obliged to attack. At this point, I go ahead and tap down the Siege or Rhinoceros and slam with my 5/5, getting in there and putting her down to 8 and gaining 5, which means that any ability for her to race us is likely negligible at this point, despite being able to remove my 2 most relevant cards in Ajani and Silverblade Paladin. She plays out a Reclamation Sage, which destroys my Honor of the Peer. Note, though, that I've drawn well into Council's Judgment, and I also have a Benalish Marshal underneath the Windbrisk Heights, which is going to be a great deal of surprise value during this combat step and actually allow me to win. So I go ahead and activate the Windbrisk Heights and put the Benalish Marshal into play, getting a card off Bygone Bishop, ostensibly also getting a bolster trigger off of the Anafenza, the Kintree Spirit, as well as giving all of my creatures +1/+1. So where does the +1/+1 counter go from Anafenza? It goes onto the flyer more than likely, which is going to mean that I'm attacking for 4, 7, 9 damage, 4, 8, 11 damage this turn that is going to be unblocked. I'm also going to win in combat against the Tassiger and against the Reclamation Sage, and solely lose my Anafenza in the combat step, which is a bit of tempo that there's probably no way to come back from. Acknowledge this is turn 9, and she has some sizable critters in play to include Tasker and Siege Rhino. But the little white deck that could is able to synergistically through its many I don't know how to put it, I guess synergistic threats. Through its many synergistic threats, it's able to kind of bolster itself, no pun intended, to a point where its individual threats are actually close to on parity with a 6 mana spell and a 4 mana spell, despite being 1 and 2 mana cards. So that is kind of the power of this deck, either Armageddon or just sheer tempo. Very cool deck. Very cool format. I put this up and kind of, put a call out to all of the old school players as well. If you enjoy old school, you'll enjoy this format if you give it a shot. It's a little more expensive to get into. It requires a lot more knowledge and playtesting because you're playing with basically the whole depth of the card pool of Magic the Gathering. But it's certainly very beautiful. You can go from playing something like Sultai, Oathloam, or to something as simple as White Weenie Beatdown, and I think have a great deal of fun in it, and really see a lot of cool decks. So I hope you guys enjoyed this deck tech and this show of gameplay for White Weenie, one of the best entry level decks I think for the format, and yeah, give it a shot if it interests you, and I think you'd find that you enjoy it quite a bit. Thanks, guys, and take care now.